Tonight, we journey into a world that most historians have never truly understood: the intimate daily rhythms of Viking Nordic villages, where secrets were whispered through wooden walls and ancient traditions shaped every breath of life. You're about to discover what happened during those long winter nights when the fire burned low and voices grew soft. But first, imagine smoke curling through hand-carved rafters, while shadows danced across faces that held stories no chronicle ever recorded. The truth about Viking village life isn't found in the dramatic sagas of conquest and battle. It lies hidden in the mundane moments: the creak of timber settling in the cold, the gentle splash of nets being mended by firelight, and the hushed conversations that carried wisdom from one generation to the next. But there's something else, something that even the most dedicated scholars have overlooked about these wooden sanctuaries and the people who called them home. Tonight, as we explore these forgotten corners of Nordic history, you'll uncover a mystery that connects the rhythm of daily fishing routines to the ancient art of storytelling in ways that will change how you see the Viking world forever. Welcome to the serene world of Viking Nordic villages, where life unfolded at the gentle pace of changing seasons and the eternal rhythm of waves against wooden hulls. Our journey tonight takes us beyond the violent raids and dramatic conquests that fill most history books into the quiet corners where real Viking life happened, in the soft glow of hearth fires, the patient mending of nets, and the whispered tales that shaped young minds. Picture yourself settling into the warmth of a longhouse as winter darkness settles over a small coastal village. The day's fishing boats have returned to harbor, their wooden hulls creaking softly against simple docks. Smoke rises from chimneys throughout the settlement, carrying the scent of burning peat and cooking fish. Children's voices fade to whispers as families gather around central hearths and the ancient ritual of storytelling begins. This is where we'll spend our time together, not in the chaos of battle, but in the peaceful rhythms that sustained Viking communities for centuries. Here, in these wooden sanctuaries surrounded by pine forests and fjords, ordinary people created extraordinary lives through the simple acts of building homes, catching fish, and sharing stories that connected them to both their ancestors and their gods. The first thing you notice about a Viking village isn't the grandeur, it's the intimate scale of everything. These weren't bustling cities or imposing fortresses, but clusters of elongated wooden buildings that seemed to grow organically from the landscape itself. Most villages consisted of just 6 or 7 farms arranged around a common area, where the rhythm of daily life played out in patterns established over generations. The long houses that dominated each farm were marvels of practical engineering, built to withstand the harshest winters while maximizing precious warmth and light. These structures typically stretched between 50 and 70 feet in length, but rarely exceeded 15 feet in width, creating that distinctive ship-like silhouette that would become synonymous with Viking architecture. The curved walls, built from massive oak timbers in Denmark or sturdy pine logs in Norway and Sweden, gave each building an organic quality that seemed almost alive. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, a detail that reveals something profound about Viking priorities that most people never consider. The positioning of these longhouses wasn't random. They were deliberately aligned with the natural slope of the land, with one end always facing toward the water and the other toward the inland forests. This wasn't just about drainage or convenience. It was about something much deeper, something that connected these practical people to the spiritual rhythms of their world in ways that even they might not have fully understood. The construction process itself was a community ritual that reinforced the bonds holding these small villages together. When a family needed a new longhouse, neighbors would gather with their axes and adzes, their augers for drilling holes, and their hammers for driving wooden pegs. The work began with the careful selection of trees. Not just any timber would do. Oak was prized for its strength and durability, particularly for the massive posts that would support the roof and walls. Pine and other coniferous woods served for the planking and smaller structural elements, chosen not just for their availability, but for their resistance to rot in the damp Nordic climate. The Vikings had developed sophisticated joining techniques that allowed these buildings to flex and move with temperature changes without losing their structural integrity. Notched corner joints were carved with such precision that the buildings could expand and contract through the seasons while maintaining their weather-tight seal. The walls themselves were marvels of insulation technology. Between the massive timber frame, craftsmen would weave panels of wattle, thin branches interlaced to create a flexible mesh. This framework was then covered with daub, a mixture of clay, dung, and straw that hardened into an effective barrier against wind and moisture. In regions where timber was scarce, like Iceland and Greenland, builders developed entirely different techniques using peat and turf blocks that provided even better insulation. These peat walls could be more than 4 feet thick, built up in layers with stones along the inner and outer edges for stability. The technique required intimate knowledge of soil conditions and seasonal changes. Peat had to be cut at just the right time of year and assembled with careful attention to moisture content and settling patterns. The finished walls had a gentle inward slope that helped them bear the weight of heavy turf roofs while creating interiors that felt both cozy and secure. The roofs presented their own engineering challenges and revealed another layer of Viking ingenuity. Rather than simply shedding water, these roofs were designed to be living systems that improved with age. Layers of birch bark provided the initial water seal, covered with carefully selected turf that would take root and grow into a protective green carpet. Small stones or wooden battens held everything in place during storms, while the living roof provided insulation that actually improved over time as the grass roots created an increasingly dense barrier against heat loss. But the most intriguing aspect of these buildings, the detail that hints at deeper mysteries in Viking village life, was the interior arrangement. These weren't simply large open spaces, but carefully organized environments that reflected complex social relationships and spiritual beliefs. The central hearth ran the length of the building, creating zones of warmth and activity that corresponded to different aspects of daily life. The area closest to the main entrance was typically reserved for work activities, weaving, tool repair, and food preparation. The center of the building, around the main fire pit, was where families gathered for meals and evening storytelling. The far end, the darkest and most private area, was where people slept and where the most sacred household rituals took place. This spatial organization wasn't arbitrary. It reflected ancient beliefs about the flow of spiritual energy and the proper ordering of human activities that connected Viking families to cosmic patterns they sensed, but rarely spoke about directly. The daily rhythm of life in these wooden sanctuaries followed patterns that had been refined over centuries of trial and adaptation. Families woke before dawn to tend the fire that had burned continuously through the night. This wasn't just about warmth. Maintaining the hearth fire was considered a sacred responsibility that connected each household to their ancestors and ensured the continuity of their lineage. Women rose first to rebuild the fire from banked coals, adding carefully prepared peat bricks or seasoned wood that would provide steady, smokeless heat for the day's activities. The process was almost ritualistic. The selection of fuel, the gentle coaxing of flames, the gradual building of heat that would warm both bodies and spirits. Children learned by watching, understanding that the hearth was the heart of the home in ways both practical and mystical. As smoke began to curl up through the central smoke hole, the longhouse would gradually come alive with the soft sounds of daily preparation. Wooden bowls and tools would be arranged for the morning meal, usually a simple porridge made from barley or oats, supplemented with preserved fish or meat. The smell of cooking food would mingle with the ever-present scent of wood smoke and the earthier odors of the peat-walled buildings, creating an aromatic signature that visitors could recognize from considerable distances. But before we explore the fishing routines that provided much of the protein for these village meals, there's something else about these morning rituals that reveals a crucial aspect of Viking spirituality. Something that explains why their storytelling traditions were so intimately connected to their daily work patterns, and why the boundary between practical activity and sacred practice was far more fluid than most historians have recognized. According to archaeological evidence from sites like Hedeby and other well-preserved Viking settlements, the fishing techniques employed by these Nordic communities were far more sophisticated than simple hook and line operations. Dr. Marlene Henningson's excavation work has revealed an intricate understanding of seasonal fishing cycles that required intimate knowledge of weather patterns, fish behavior, and coastal geography. The tools themselves tell a remarkable story of adaptation and innovation. Iron hooks found in Viking archaeological sites show remarkable consistency in design. They feature the same basic loop and point configuration that modern fishermen would immediately recognize, but with subtle variations that reveal specialized knowledge about different species and fishing conditions. The largest hooks, designed for deep-water cod fishing, were forged with reinforced shanks that could handle the stress of hauling large fish up from significant depths. Smaller, more delicate hooks were crafted for catching herring and other schooling fish that required finesse rather than brute strength. Net construction represented an even more sophisticated technology. Archaeological fragments reveal that Viking fishing nets were woven from three-stranded bast cords using specialized techniques that created patterns of remarkable durability. These weren't simple mesh bags, but engineered systems designed to work in specific water conditions. The mesh size varied depending on target species, with different sections of the same net featuring different weaving patterns to optimize catch efficiency while minimizing escape routes for trapped fish. The floats and sinkers used with these nets demonstrate another level of technical sophistication. Floats were typically made from rolled birch bark, a material that provided excellent buoyancy while remaining flexible enough to move naturally with wave action. The sinkers, crafted from soapstone and other heavy materials, were carefully balanced to keep nets at optimal fishing depths while allowing for easy retrieval. Some sinkers featured ingenious designs where stones were held in place by birch bark wrappings that would eventually deteriorate, allowing the nets to surface naturally if they became snagged on underwater obstacles. The boats used for fishing expeditions were marvels of engineering that reflected centuries of accumulated wisdom about hull design and water handling. Small dugout canoes, carved from single tree trunks, provided stable platforms for near-shore fishing. These vessels were designed with subtle curves and weight distributions that made them incredibly stable in choppy water, while remaining maneuverable enough for precise positioning over fishing grounds. Larger, clinker-built boats demonstrated even more advanced construction techniques. The overlapping plank construction, held together with iron rivets, and sealed with tar and animal hair, created hulls that were both flexible and watertight. These boats could handle open water conditions while carrying substantial loads of fish and equipment back to village harbors. The fishing calendar itself reveals the depth of Viking ecological knowledge. Spring fishing focused on spawning runs of salmon and other anadromous species that could be caught with weirs and traps positioned in rivers and streams. Summer brought opportunities for deep water fishing, when longer daylight hours allowed boats to venture farther from shore in pursuit of cod, haddock, and other valuable species. Autumn fishing concentrated on herring and other schooling fish that gathered in coastal waters before winter. Winter fishing, conducted through holes cut in ice-covered lakes and fjords, required entirely different techniques and equipment, but provided crucial protein during the season when other food sources were scarce. The preservation techniques used to store these seasonal catches were equally sophisticated. Drying racks positioned to take advantage of prevailing winds could preserve fish for months without spoilage. Smoking techniques using specific wood types created flavors while extending storage life. Salt, when available, was used to create preserved fish that could serve as trade goods as well as winter sustenance. According to recent analysis of refuse middens from multiple Viking sites, fish and seafood comprised up to 60% of the protein in typical village diets. This wasn't just about availability. It reflects deliberate choices about resource management and community nutrition that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of sustainable harvesting practices. Villages that flourished for centuries did so because they understood the balance between taking what they needed and leaving enough for future generations. But the most intriguing aspect of Viking fishing culture, according to maritime archaeologists, was how closely integrated it was with their storytelling traditions. The skalds who entertained families during long winter evenings weren't separate from the working life of the community. They were often fishermen themselves, whose intimate knowledge of seasonal cycles and weather patterns informed the structure and timing of their performances. Recent analysis of skaldic poetry reveals sophisticated understanding of tidal patterns, seasonal fish migrations, and weather prediction techniques that could only have come from direct experience on the water. These poet-fishermen created narrative frameworks that helped preserve crucial survival knowledge while entertaining their audiences during the dark months when fishing was impossible or dangerous. Remember that mysterious detail about longhouse orientation we mentioned earlier? How these buildings were always positioned with one end facing the water and the other toward the inland forests? Here's where that seemingly simple architectural choice reveals its deeper significance and why it connects so intimately to the storytelling traditions that sustained these communities through their darkest months. The orientation wasn't just practical, it was cosmological. The water-facing end represented the realm of the known, the daily rhythm of fishing boats departing and returning, the predictable cycles that sustained life. The forest-facing end opened toward the unknown, the wilderness where spirits dwelt and ancient stories originated. When families gathered around their central hearths for evening storytelling, they were literally positioned between these two worlds, with the skald's voice carrying them from the familiar rhythms of daily work into the mysterious realms where gods and heroes lived. This spatial arrangement explains why fishing stories and mythological tales were so often intertwined in Viking narrative traditions. The same voice that described the morning's catch would, as darkness fell, weave tales of sea serpents and underwater kingdoms. Children learning to mend nets by day would hear those same rhythmic motions echoed in stories of the Norns weaving the fates of heroes. The skalds understood something that modern entertainment has forgotten. that the most powerful stories emerge from the intersection of daily experience and mythic imagination. A fisherman who had battled storms and read the subtle signs of weather change brought authentic weight to tales of Thor's battles with the giants. A woman who had preserved fish through difficult winters could tell stories of Frigg's foresight that carried the authority of lived experience. But here's the detail that reveals the true sophistication of this tradition. The timing of these stories was precisely calibrated to the rhythms of village life in ways that created almost hypnotic effects on listeners. As archaeological evidence from hearth sites reveals, the central fires were built up to their highest intensity just as the evening meal ended. The combination of full stomachs, maximum warmth, and carefully controlled lighting created optimal conditions for the altered states of consciousness that made epic storytelling so powerful. The skalds knew exactly how long different types of stories should last, how to modulate their voices to match the gradual dying of the fire, how to use the interplay of light and shadow to enhance dramatic moments. They understood that the slow cooling of the longhouse created a natural progression from wakefulness towards sleep, and they structured their narratives to guide listeners through this transition. Remember those carved runes we mentioned on the wooden beams? They weren't just protective symbols. They were memory aids for the storytellers. Each carved mark corresponded to specific narrative elements, creating a visual framework that helped skalds remember the intricate details of their vast repertoires. A skilled storyteller could glance at these carved reminders and seamlessly weave together fishing reports from that day with ancient tales of sea voyages and divine adventures. The most accomplished skalds developed techniques for incorporating current events into traditional story frameworks. If a particular fishing expedition had encountered unusual difficulties, that experience would be woven into familiar tales of heroic struggles against supernatural obstacles. If the community was facing food shortages, stories would emphasize themes of resourcefulness and community cooperation that provided both entertainment and practical guidance. This brings us back to those morning fishing routines and why they were so much more than simple food gathering. Every aspect of preparing boats, checking equipment, and venturing onto the water was understood as participating in ancient patterns that connected individual fishermen to the cosmic struggles between order and chaos that formed the foundation of Norse mythology. The daily departure of fishing boats recreated Odin's daily journey across the sky. The careful examination of weather signs echoed the vigilance required to detect the subtle warnings that preceded Ragnarok. The patient mending of nets during long winter evenings became a metaphor for the delicate work of maintaining the social fabric that held communities together through their most challenging seasons. Even the most mundane aspects of fish preservation carried mythological significance. The smoking and drying techniques that ensured winter survival were understood as participating in the same transformational processes that the gods used to create order from chaos. The salt that preserved fish was connected to the tears of goddesses. The smoke that flavored and preserved meat was linked to the fires that would eventually consume and renew the world. But there's still one more layer to this intricate system. Something about the relationship between the rhythm of storytelling and the rhythm of seasonal fishing that reveals why these wooden villages were able to maintain their cultural traditions for centuries, even as the political landscape around them changed dramatically. As we near the end of our journey through these peaceful Viking villages, the gentle crackling of dying embers and countless hearths seems to whisper a secret that has remained hidden for over 1,000 years. All of this time, we've been exploring what we thought were simply the practical rhythms of daily life, The building of wooden homes, the seasonal patterns of fishing, the evening rituals of storytelling around warm fires. But here's the revelation that changes everything. These weren't separate activities at all. They were components of a single, integrated system designed to preserve something far more precious than food or shelter. The Viking villagers weren't just surviving the harsh northern climate. They were maintaining a technology of consciousness, a method for preserving and transmitting the deepest wisdom of their culture through the most ordinary activities of daily life. The wooden longhouses, with their precise orientation between water and forest, were actually meditation chambers designed to facilitate specific states of awareness. The fishing expeditions, with their careful attention to weather signs and seasonal cycles, were training exercises in the kind of deep observation that allowed ancient peoples to perceive patterns invisible to modern minds. The evening storytelling sessions, timed to coincide with the optimal conditions created by dying fires and communal warmth, were sophisticated techniques for encoding complex knowledge in forms that could survive the collapse of civilizations. The skalds weren't simply entertainers or even historians. They were the keepers of a living library that preserved not just stories, but the consciousness required to understand what those stories really meant. Every tale of gods and heroes contained multiple layers of practical knowledge about survival, community building, and the cultivation of wisdom. The mythological framework wasn't primitive superstition. It was an advanced information storage system that allowed crucial knowledge to be preserved and transmitted even when the political and economic structures that supported formal education collapsed. The fishing nets, those marvels of engineering that seemed to demonstrate only practical ingenuity, were actually physical representations of the cognitive nets used to capture and hold elusive insights. The careful balance of floats and sinkers that kept nets at optimal depth mirrored the balance of attention required to maintain awareness of both practical necessities and deeper meanings. The patient work of mending nets during long winter evenings was practice in the same kind of careful attention required to maintain the integrity of cultural transmission across generations. Even the smoke that filled these longhouses, which we initially saw as simply an unavoidable byproduct of heating technology, served a deeper purpose. Recent research into altered states of consciousness suggests that the controlled inhalation of specific types of wood smoke can induce subtle changes in brain chemistry that enhance memory formation and pattern recognition. The Vikings weren't just tolerating smoky houses. They were creating controlled environments that optimized the conditions for learning and cultural transmission. The fish themselves, those daily catches that seemed to represent simple protein acquisition, were symbols in a complex system of ecological wisdom that taught lessons about sustainability, community cooperation, and the delicate balance required to maintain abundance across generations. Every aspect of the fishing process, from the careful reading of weather signs to the precise timing of preservation techniques, reinforced habits of attention and patience that were essential for maintaining the deeper wisdom traditions. As the last embers fade in our imaginary hearth and the stories wind toward their conclusion, we're left with a profound question that the Vikings themselves might have posed as they settled into sleep after an evening of tales and fellowship. If these simple wooden villages, with their practical fishing routines and cozy storytelling traditions, were actually sophisticated educational institutions designed to maintain humanity's deepest wisdom across the generations, what does that suggest about our own daily routines and the potential they might hold for preserving what matters most? The gentle sound of waves against wooden hulls continues through the night, carrying secrets that are still waiting to be fully understood. In the darkness of a 1,000-year-old longhouse, the questions that mattered most to our ancestors remain as relevant as ever. How do we create communities that can preserve wisdom across generations? How do we embed our deepest values in the most ordinary activities of daily life? And how do we ensure that the essential knowledge survives even when the structures that support it seem to be crumbling around us? These quiet Viking villages, with their wooden homes, patient fishing rhythms, and fireside tales, offer us a model that deserves far more attention than it has received. Perhaps tomorrow, as we go about our own daily routines, we might listen a little more carefully to the whispers hidden in the most ordinary moments, the ones that might be trying to teach us secrets we've forgotten we ever knew. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in the eternal realm of story and memory, those Viking hearths are still burning, and the ancient wisdom they preserved continues to flicker in the darkness, waiting for anyone patient enough to sit quietly and listen to what the flames have to say. But that's a story for another night, when the conditions are right and the fire burns with just the perfect intensity to reveal the deeper mysteries that still lie hidden in the intersection of daily work and timeless wonder.